Sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you never noticed watching from the crowd. I used to think survival was about strength, about working harder, sleeping less, smiling through exhaustion, until nobody noticed how close you were to breaking. Then life taught me a different lesson. Sometimes survival is simply refusing to give up one more day. My alarm rang at 5:15 every morning. By 5:45, I was already in the kitchen packing lunches, signing school forms, and trying to convince my 8-year-old son that cereal counted as breakfast. Ethan sat at the table swinging his legs while sunlight slowly crept through our apartment window. It was not much of an apartment. 800 square feet. Aging appliances. Thin walls. Rent that seemed to increase every year. But it was ours. And after everything life had thrown at us, that mattered. "Mom," Ethan asked one morning, "do rich people ever worry?" I looked up from packing his lunch. "Of course they do." He frowned. "Then why does everyone act like money fixes everything?" I smiled sadly. "Children always ask the hardest questions. Because money solves some problems," I said. "But not all of them." Ethan seemed satisfied with that answer. I wished I was. After dropping him off at school, I drove to the children's hospital where I worked as a pediatric nurse. Most days passed in a blur of medication schedules, patient charts, worried parents, and endless hallways filled with fluorescent light. It was exhausting work. Emotional work. But I loved it. Every time a frightened child smiled. Every time a family received good news. Every time a patient finally went home. Those moments reminded me why I stayed. Unfortunately, love did not pay bills. By the end of every month, I found myself staring at spreadsheets and bank statements, trying to stretch every dollar a little farther. Medical bills from years earlier still followed me. Student loans remained stubbornly present. And despite working overtime whenever possible, the numbers never seemed to cooperate. Then came the phone call that changed everything. My mother asked me to visit that Sunday. The moment I walked into her house, I knew something was wrong. My mother rarely looked nervous. That afternoon, she could barely meet my eyes. My uncle sat at the dining room table. So did several other relatives. The atmosphere felt less like a family gathering and more like an intervention. "Madison," my uncle began carefully, "we are worried about your future." I immediately hated where the conversation was heading. 20 minutes later, my stomach felt completely hollow. A wealthy widower named Walter Harrison had apparently expressed interest in marriage. He was 60 years old, financially secure, well-connected, generous. Every relative in the room described him as though they were presenting an investment opportunity. Not a husband. Not a human being. An opportunity. "You would never struggle again," someone said. "Ethan would have everything he needs," another added. I stared at them in disbelief. "You are asking me to marry a man nearly 30 years older than me." Silence followed. Nobody denied it. My mother finally reached for my hand. "We only want you to be safe." Safe. The word followed me for days afterward. Safe from debt. Safe from uncertainty. Safe from hardship. But every time I imagined that future, something inside me refused to agree. Late Friday evening, after finishing a long hospital shift, I stepped outside into the cool air. The parking lot glowed beneath rows of streetlights. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, completely uncertain about what came next. Then a sleek black luxury car pulled quietly to the curb near the hospital entrance. The rear door opened. A tall man stepped out wearing a dark tailored coat. Even from a distance, there was something unmistakably commanding about him. Then he looked directly at me. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like he already knew exactly who I was. For a moment, neither of us moved. The cool evening air carried the distant sound of traffic and the soft hum of the hospital generators. The stranger closed the car door behind him and walked toward me with calm, measured steps. He looked to be in his early 60s, distinguished rather than intimidating, with silver at his temples and the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility. Yet there was something unusual about the way he looked at me. Not curiosity. Recognition. As though he had arrived exactly where he intended to be. I tightened my grip on my bag. "Can I help you?" The man stopped several feet away. His expression softened slightly. Madison Brooks? Hearing my name immediately put me on guard. Yes. He nodded once. My name is Alexander Hayes. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. Then realization hit me. Hayes Capital. Hayes Foundation. Hayes Medical Research Center. His name appeared on buildings throughout the state. My pulse quickened. The Alexander Hayes? A faint smile touched his face. I suppose so. I stared at him, struggling to understand why one of the wealthiest men in the country was standing outside a children's hospital waiting for me. Before I could ask another question, he spoke again. I apologize for approaching you this way. I realize it is unusual. Unusual was an understatement. How do you know who I am? Something unreadable crossed his eyes. Then it vanished. That is a long answer. The response only deepened my confusion. Alexander glanced toward the hospital entrance before returning his attention to me. Would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee? Every instinct told me to decline. My life had taught me to be cautious, especially when situations made no sense. Yet there was nothing threatening about him. If anything, he seemed strangely nervous. That surprised me more than anything else. Billionaires were not supposed to look nervous. I should get home to my son, I said carefully. The moment the words left my mouth, something changed in his expression. Warmth. Genuine warmth. Ethan is 8 years old, he said quietly. And he has a science project due next Tuesday. My heart nearly stopped. How do you know that? Alexander immediately realized his mistake. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. As I said, he replied softly, the answer is complicated. Every warning bell in my mind started ringing. Yet somehow I remained standing there instead of walking away. Perhaps because his voice contained no manipulation. No arrogance. Only honesty. Finally he exhaled. Slowly. Madison, I know this sounds impossible, but I need to speak with you about something important. I folded my arms. What kind of important? Alexander looked directly into my eyes. The kind that could change the rest of your life. The statement should have sounded dramatic. Instead, it sounded sincere. A long silence followed. Then I surprised myself. 10 minutes, I said. Relief flashed across his face. Thank you. 20 minutes later, we sat in a quiet coffee shop near the hospital. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The evening crowd had mostly disappeared. Alexander wrapped his hands around a coffee cup but barely touched it. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Finally, he looked up. I know your family is pressuring you into a marriage you do not want. My stomach tightened instantly. How do you know that? His gaze never wavered. Because I have been paying attention for a very long time. Then he reached into his coat pocket, placed a business card on the table between us, and said the last thing I expected to hear. Instead, I would like you to marry me. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. The sounds of the coffee shop seemed to disappear. Rain continued tapping against the windows. A barista called someone's name near the counter. Yet all I could hear was the sentence Alexander Hayes had just spoken. Marry me. Of all the possibilities I had imagined walking into that conversation, none of them included a marriage proposal from a billionaire I had met less than an hour earlier. You cannot be serious, I finally said. Alexander's expression remained calm. I am completely serious. I leaned back in my chair and laughed softly in disbelief. Not because anything was funny, because my brain was struggling to process reality. You know almost everything about me, I said. And I know almost nothing about you. He nodded. That is fair. Then explain. For a moment, he seemed to consider how much to reveal. I am not asking for a traditional marriage, he said carefully. I am offering a partnership. I folded my arms. A partnership that includes wedding vows? A faint smile touched his face. Something like that. The next hour passed in a blur of questions and answers. Alexander explained that there would be no pressure. No expectations beyond honesty and mutual respect. Ethan's future would be secure. My independence would remain intact. I could continue working at the hospital. Continue raising my son the way I believed was right. Every concern I raised seemed to have already been considered. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made me wonder how long he had been thinking about this. Eventually, I asked the question that had been bothering me since the beginning. Why me? The answer did not come immediately. Alexander looked down at his coffee before meeting my eyes again. Because I trust you. My confusion deepened. You barely know me. Something almost sad appeared in his expression. You would be surprised. The conversation ended without a decision. Alexander handed me a card with a private phone number and stood to leave. Take your time, he said. Whatever you decide, it should be your choice. Then he walked away. No pressure. No persuasión. No dramatic speech. Just patience. Over the next week, his proposal followed me everywhere. At work. At home. During sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling. My family continued discussing the other marriage arrangement, as though it were already settled. Every conversation left me feeling trapped. Meanwhile, Alexander never called. Never appeared unexpectedly. Never pushed for an answer. Somehow that made a greater impression than any grand gesture could have. Then everything changed because of Ethan. One evening, I found him sitting quietly at the kitchen table. His homework remained untouched. That alone was unusual. Ethan normally finished assignments before I even asked. What is wrong? I asked gently. He hesitated before answering. Mom, are we going to have to move? My heart sank. Why would you ask that? He looked down. I heard Grandma talking. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Ethan was trying to be brave. I could see it in his eyes. But underneath that bravery lived fear. Fear about our future. Fear about losing the life we had built together. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone by the apartment window. City lights flickered beyond the glass. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a different future. Not luxury. Not wealth. Stability. Safety. Opportunity. The next morning, I picked up Alexander's card. My hand trembled slightly as I dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. Madison. The way he said my name made it sound as though he had been waiting beside the phone all week. I closed my eyes briefly. Then I took a deep breath. I would like to meet again, I said. The silence that followed lasted only a second. But somehow, I knew my life had already begun to change. 3 days later, I found myself standing in front of the largest house I had ever seen. Even now, the memory feels unreal. The long private driveway curved through acres of perfectly maintained gardens. Tall oak trees lined the road. A fountain sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. The estate looked less like a home, and more like something from a movie. Ethan pressed his face against the car window. Mom, he whispered. Is this where kings live? I laughed despite my nerves. I do not think kings live in America. Then billionaires do. His answer was immediate. Alexander, seated beside us in the back of the car, smiled quietly without correcting him. During the second meeting, everything had happened surprisingly fast. We talked for hours. About expectations. About Ethan. About boundaries. About the future. Alexander never tried to sell me a dream. He spoke honestly about responsibility, partnership, and trust. Somehow that honesty mattered more than his wealth ever could. 1 week later, we stood in a small private chapel surrounded by only a handful of witnesses. No reporters. No elaborate celebration. No dramatic spectacle. Just a simple ceremony. I remember glancing toward Alexander before the vows began. He looked calm as always. Yet there was something different in his eyes. Relief. As though he had spent years carrying a burden nobody else could see. The ceremony itself lasted less than 20 minutes. Then suddenly it was finished. I was married. Again, reality struggled to keep pace with events. Yet strangely, I did not feel trapped. I felt safe. That surprised me most of all. After arriving at the estate, Alexander personally showed us around. Ethan was fascinated by everything. The library. The indoor pool. The movie room. The gardens. Every few minutes he discovered something new and ran ahead excitedly. Watching him smile without worry felt like a gift I had not realized we needed. Eventually, Alexander opened a set of double doors at the end of a long hallway. This suite is yours, he said. I stepped inside and stopped immediately. Large windows overlooked the gardens. Fresh flowers sat on a table near the balcony. Family photographs had not yet been added, but somehow the room already felt welcoming. Then I noticed something unexpected. Across the hall was another suite. I turned toward him. Your room. Alexander nodded. Across from yours. For several seconds I simply stared. Separate bedrooms. Separate spaces. Complete respect for my comfort. Once again he had anticipated a concern before I could express it. That evening, after unpacking, Ethan and I joined Alexander for dinner. The dining room was elegant without feeling intimidating. Candlelight reflected softly across the polished table. Conversation remained surprisingly easy. Ethan talked about school. Alexander listened carefully. Not politely. Genuinely. Every detail seemed to matter to him. At one point, Ethan mentioned an upcoming science fair project involving solar energy. Most adults would have nodded and changed the subject. Alexander spent 10 minutes asking questions. Real questions. Curious questions. By the end of dinner, Ethan looked completely captivated. Later that night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at me thoughtfully. Mom. Yes. He hesitated. I think he likes us. The simple observation caught me off guard. Children often notice truths adults overlooked. After Ethan fell asleep, I stood by the window overlooking the moonlit gardens. The estate was quiet, peaceful. Yet one question continued lingering in the back of my mind. Alexander knew too much. About me. About Ethan. About details I never remembered sharing. As I watched the lights glowing from another wing of the house, I realized something important. I still did not know why a man like Alexander Hayes had chosen us. And somehow, I had the feeling the real answer had nothing to do with marriage at all. The first few weeks inside the estate passed more peacefully than I expected. That alone felt strange. I had prepared myself for awkward conversations, complicated expectations, and the constant reminder that my new life existed because of an extraordinary decision. Instead, life settled into a rhythm. Every morning, Ethan left for school smiling. Every evening we ate dinner together. Some nights Alexander joined us. Other nights business responsibilities kept him away. Yet even when he was absent, his presence seemed woven into every corner of the house. Small acts of thoughtfulness appeared everywhere. One afternoon, I mentioned that Ethan loved astronomy. 2 days later, a telescope appeared in the observatory room overlooking the gardens. Another time, I casually mentioned that the children's ward at the hospital needed additional art supplies. The following week, anonymous donations arrived. Nothing extravagant. Just exactly what was needed. Alexander never mentioned any of it. That was perhaps what affected me most. He never seemed interested in recognition. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found Ethan laughing so hard he could barely stand. Alexander sat across from him holding a stack of construction paper. Between them sat what appeared to be the world's most crooked homemade rocket. What happened? I asked. Ethan pointed proudly. We built it. Alexander examined the lopsided creation with complete seriousness. It may not survive re-entry. Ethan burst into laughter again. Watching them together stirred something unexpected inside me. My son had never known a stable father figure. His biological father disappeared before Ethan was born. Over the years, I learned how to fill both roles. Yet standing there in the sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, I realized something important. Alexander was not trying to replace anyone. He was simply showing up. Consistently. Genuinely. Every single day. Later that afternoon, Ethan and I explored another section of the estate. The property seemed endless. Walking trails wound through acres of gardens and wooded paths. Eventually, we discovered a small guest cottage near the far edge of the grounds. Curious, I stepped inside. The cottage appeared unused, but one room immediately caught my attention. Shelves lined the walls. Framed photographs sat on several tables. Most looked like community events, charity fundraisers, hospital programs, and educational projects. As I moved closer, something felt familiar. Then I froze. One photograph showed a literacy fundraiser from nearly 10 years ago. A younger version of me stood near a group of volunteers. My breath caught. I remembered the event. Barely. Yet there I was. I picked up the frame and stared. Another photograph sat nearby. Different year. Different charity program. Again, I appeared somewhere in the background. Confusion quickly replaced surprise. Why would these photographs be here? Why would Alexander keep them? Before I could examine further, footsteps sounded behind me. I turned. Alexander stood in the doorway. For the first time since I met him, he looked genuinely startled. His eyes moved from me to the photograph in my hands. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence felt heavier than usual. Finally, I lowered the frame. Alexander. His expression remained unreadable. Yes. I glanced around the room once more. Photographs. Programs. Newspaper clippings. Years of moments I barely remembered. Yet somehow they had all been preserved. Carefully. Intentionally. My pulse quickened. Why do you have pictures of me from 10 years ago? For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then something shifted in his eyes. Not fear. Not embarrassment. Something closer to acceptance. As though a secret he had carried for a very long time had finally found its way into the light. And in that moment, I knew the answer would change everything I thought I understood about our marriage. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the cottage windows, illuminating years of photographs, newspaper clippings, event programs, and carefully preserved memories. The silence felt almost sacred. Alexander stood near the doorway as though he understood there was no way to explain everything with a single sentence. Finally, he walked into the room. His movements remained calm, but I could see tension beneath that calm. The same tension I had noticed on our wedding day. I suppose this conversation was inevitable, he said quietly. I lowered the photograph still resting in my hands. How long? His gaze moved across the room before returning to me. 10 years. The answer landed harder than I expected. 10 years. Not 10 weeks. Not 10 months. A decade. I looked around again. Every photograph suddenly carried a different meaning. Every clipping. Every program. Every memory. You have known me for 10 years? I asked. Alexander nodded. Yes. My pulse quickened. But I do not remember meeting you. A faint smile touched his face. That is because we never truly met. The explanation only deepened my confusion. Slowly, Alexander crossed the room and picked up one of the framed photographs from a nearby shelf. It showed a charity literacy event from years earlier. I recognized the day immediately. Hundreds of volunteers, families, teachers, community leaders. I had given a short speech about childhood education. To me, it was one event among many. To Alexander, apparently, it was something else entirely. You were standing on a small stage, he said softly. Most people spoke about funding goals and publicity. You spoke about a little girl who finally learned to read her first book. I stared at him. The memory returned slowly. I remember her. His expression softened. I know. Something about those words made my chest tighten. Alexander placed the photograph back on the shelf. Everyone else talked about numbers. You talked about people. The room grew very quiet. That was the first time I noticed you. I did not know what to say. The idea felt impossible. Yet nothing about his expression suggested exaggeration. He was simply telling the truth. After that, I asked. He exhaled slowly. After that, I occasionally saw your name connected to community projects, hospital volunteer programs, educational events, charity work. His eyes met mine. Every time, the story was the same. You showed up when people needed help. Emotion slowly replaced confusion. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. There was admiration in his voice. Respect. The kind that cannot be manufactured. Alexander. He shook his head gently. I never intended for any of this to happen. A sad smile appeared. Life rarely asks permission. For the next hour, he told me pieces of a story I never knew existed. Small moments where our lives had crossed paths without my knowledge. Events where he stood in the crowd. Fundraisers. hospital projects, community programs, never approaching, never interfering, simply watching from a distance. Not because he expected anything, because he genuinely admired the person I was. Finally, I looked around the cottage one last time. You kept all of this? His answer came immediately. Yes. There was no embarrassment. No attempt to minimize it. Just honesty. My eyes moved toward a newspaper clipping pinned near the far wall. Beneath it sat a worn envelope. Unlike everything else, it looked personal. Almost fragile. Following my gaze, Alexander became very still. For the first time that afternoon, genuine uncertainty appeared on his face. I stepped closer and picked up the envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Across the front, written in neat handwriting, were 3 simple words. To Madison Brooks. My heart skipped. Slowly, I looked back at him. And somehow I already knew that whatever waited inside that envelope would reveal the part of his story he had never shared with anyone. My fingers trembled slightly as I held the envelope. The cottage suddenly felt smaller, quieter. Every photograph surrounding us seemed to watch from the shelves like silent witnesses to a story I never knew existed. Alexander remained standing several feet away. He did not try to stop me. He did not ask for the envelope back. Yet I could see uncertainty in his eyes. It was the first time I had ever seen him look vulnerable. Slowly I opened it. Inside were several folded pages. The paper had aged over the years. The handwriting was unmistakably his. I unfolded the first letter and began reading. The date at the top immediately caught my attention. 10 years earlier. My heart began beating faster. The letter was not dramatic. It was not poetic. It was honest. Alexander wrote about seeing me at the literacy fundraiser. About hearing me speak. About the way I seemed to notice people others overlooked. He described a little girl learning to read, and how my compassion affected everyone in the room. The words felt deeply personal. Yet there was something else. Respect. He was not writing about beauty. Not about attraction. He was writing about character. I turned to the second letter. Then the third. Each one came from a different year. Different moments. Different chapters of my life. Some referenced charity events I barely remembered. Others mentioned hospital programs or community projects. None had ever been sent. Every letter ended the same way. Folded away. Kept hidden. Waiting. By the time I reached the final page, tears blurred my vision. Not because of grand declarations. Because of the patience. 10 years of admiration without expectation. 10 years of silence rather than intrusion. 10 years of believing someone was extraordinary without asking for anything in return. I lowered the papers and looked toward Alexander. Why did you never send them? His answer came quietly. Because they were never meant to change your life. Emotion tightened my throat. Then why write them? He smiled sadly. Sometimes feelings need somewhere to exist. The simplicity of the answer nearly broke my heart. We sat together in the cottage for a long time afterward. The afternoon sunlight slowly faded. Shadows stretched across the floor. For the first time since meeting him, I began seeing the full picture. Not a billionaire. Not a powerful businessman. Not the man who rescued me from a future I did not want. I saw a human being who had spent years quietly carrying affection he never expected to be returned. Eventually, I asked the question that remained. Why propose now? Alexander leaned back slightly. His gaze moved toward one of the windows. Because when I learned about the arrangement your family was planning, I realized I had a choice. He paused. I could continue standing in the background, or I could finally step forward. His eyes returned to mine. For once I chose courage. The honesty left me speechless. We returned to the estate shortly before sunset. Neither of us spoke much during the walk back. Words seemed unnecessary. Everything important had already been said. Later that evening, I found Ethan sitting in the library working on his science project. Alexander sat nearby helping him organize notes about solar energy. The sight immediately warmed my heart. Ethan looked up and smiled. Mom, look what we built. Alexander glanced toward me. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Something had changed. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a door opening after years of being locked. As Ethan excitedly explained his project, I found myself studying the man beside him. The man who remembered details nobody else noticed. The man who protected without controlling. The man who had loved from a distance for 10 years. And for the first time, a realization settled gently into my heart. Somewhere between gratitude, trust, and understanding, my feelings had begun to change too. The days that followed felt different. Not because anything dramatic happened, because everything ordinary suddenly carried new meaning. I noticed the way Alexander always remembered the smallest details. The way he asked Ethan about school projects and actually listened to the answers. The way he quietly made life easier for everyone around him without expecting gratitude. Once the truth was revealed, I began seeing evidence of his character everywhere. It was as though someone had adjusted the focus on a camera lens. The same man stood before me, yet now I could finally see him clearly. One evening, nearly a month after discovering the letters, I found Alexander alone on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The sun had already disappeared behind the trees. Golden lights illuminated the walking paths below. The air carried the scent of fresh rain and blooming roses. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable, familiar. Eventually, I stepped beside him and rested my hands on the stone railing. I have been thinking about something, I said. Quietly. Alexander glanced toward me. That sounds serious. A small smile escaped me. It might be. His expression softened. Then I am listening. I looked out across the estate. You told me where the story started, but you never told me why it lasted. For a moment he said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly. Because every year I expected to forget you. My heart tightened. He continued watching the gardens below. Life became busier. The company expanded. Responsibilities increased. I assumed time would eventually erase what I felt. A faint smile appeared. It never did. The honesty in his voice left no room for doubt. Why? I asked. Alexander laughed softly. Not from amusement. From disbelief. I wish I knew. He turned toward me fully. Maybe because every time I heard your name, the story was always the same. His eyes held mine. You helped someone. You showed kindness. You gave more than you received. The emotion in his voice grew quieter. The world rewards many things, Madison. But it does not always reward goodness. You never let that change who you were. For several seconds, neither of us looked away. Then he said something I would never forget. You reminded me of the person I wanted to become. Tears threatened unexpectedly. Not because he was praising me. Because I realized how lonely he must have been carrying those feelings alone for so many years. Alexander. I whispered. He smiled gently. You do not owe me anything. The statement immediately revealed how little he understood. Or perhaps how little he expected. I took a slow breath. What if this is not about owing you? His expression changed. Very slightly. Yet enough for me to notice. Hope. Careful hope. The kind that arrives after years of disappointment. My pulse quickened. What if my feelings are changing because of who you are now? The silence that followed felt endless. Neither of us moved. Neither of us rushed to fill the space. Finally, Alexander looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. There was vulnerability there. Gratitude. Relief. Then that would be more than I ever imagined. At that exact moment, the terrace doors opened behind us. Ethan appeared carrying a science fair certificate almost as large as his smile. We won first place, he shouted. Instantly, both of us laughed. Ethan ran toward us, holding the certificate proudly. Alexander congratulated him while I wrapped my son in a hug. As I watched them standing together beneath the terrace lights, a realization settled deep inside my heart. 10 years ago, a story had quietly begun. But for the first time, it felt as though the future was finally beginning too. 1 year later, I stood beneath strings of golden lights stretched across the gardens of the estate, and watched dozens of families laugh together beneath the evening sky. The annual community education fundraiser had become one of my favorite traditions. Children ran across the grass carrying handmade science projects. Teachers shared stories with parents. Volunteers filled long tables with books that would soon be donated to schools throughout the state. The event felt warm, real, meaningful. Everything I had once dreamed of creating on a small scale now existed on a larger one, touching thousands of lives instead of dozens. Yet the greatest blessing had nothing to do with success. It stood beside me wearing a dark suit and a familiar quiet smile. Alexander looked exactly as he had the day he stepped out of that black car outside the hospital. Calm, steady, certain. The difference was that now I understood him. Truly understood him. The distance that once existed between us had disappeared long ago. Trust replaced uncertainty. Friendship deepened into love. And love became the foundation of something stronger than either of us imagined possible. Across the garden, Ethan stood proudly beside an educational display he helped organize. At 9 years old, he carried himself with a confidence I had never seen before. Not arrogance. Security. The kind that grows when a child knows he is loved without conditions. As guests moved through the displays, Ethan explained each project with enthusiasm. Alexander watched him with unmistakable pride. "He has your heart," I said softly. Alexander smiled. "He has your determination." We stood together in comfortable silence. The evening breeze carried music through the gardens. For a moment, I thought about the woman I used to be. Exhausted. Afraid. Constantly wondering how I would make it through another month. Back then, survival felt like the highest goal. Now life felt different. Not perfect. Simply full. A few minutes later, Ethan hurried toward us holding a framed certificate. "They approved it," he announced. "The scholarship program is officially expanding next year." His excitement was contagious. Months earlier, Ethan suggested creating a scholarship fund for children interested in science and education. Alexander helped turn the idea into reality. Watching them work together remained one of my favorite sights. Ethan grinned before looking directly at Alexander. "Dad, did you hear me?" Time seemed to pause. Not because the word was unexpected. He had been using it for months. Yet every time, it carried the same quiet power. Alexander's eyes softened immediately. "I heard you." Ethan smiled and ran back toward the display tables. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Alexander reached for my hand. A simple gesture. One that still made my heart feel lighter. "Thank you," he said quietly. I shook my head. "For what?" His gaze moved toward Ethan. "For giving me a family." Emotion rose unexpectedly in my chest. Looking around the gardens, I realized something important. 10 years ago, Alexander believed his story would remain unwritten. 1 year ago, I believed my future was closing around me. Somehow life had surprised both of us. The lights glowed warmly above the crowd. Laughter drifted through the evening air. Beside me stood the man who spent 10 years loving quietly and 1 year proving it every day. And as I rested my head gently against his shoulder, one truth echoed through my heart. The greatest love stories are not built in a single moment. They are built through patience, kindness, and the courage to stay when staying matters most.